In the winter of 1987, a school bus left the Harrow Creek parking lot just after sunrise and never arrived at school. No crash, no weather, no mayday. Just 12 children gone. For years, we called it an accident nobody saw. But in 2024, when a red backpack surfaced behind the wall of an abandoned farmhouse, so did something else. A cassette tape, labeled simply, Stop 13. Play me. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your own life. Every click helps pull another name back into the light. I'm Claire Latham, born and raised in Harrow Creek, Pennsylvania. I was 10 years old the morning the bus disappeared. Back then, we lived in a 2-story brick house just off Riverbend Road. My dad was the sheriff, my mom worked at the library, and every weekday morning, like clockwork, Bus 37 rolled by the corner stop at 6:41 a.m. It had a deep rumble and a squeaky hinge on the folding door that you could hear all the way from the front yard. I wasn't on that bus. My mom drove me to school because the bus didn't loop past our neighborhood until the second half of the route. But Ryan Albright was on it. He sat 2 rows from the back. Brown corduroy jacket, oversized backpack, crooked little smile. He was in my Sunday school class. Quiet kid. Liked to draw animals on the edges of his math worksheets. The town back then was quiet, steady. 1 high school, 1 elementary. You knew everyone's name by the 3rd week of September. Halloween parades ice on the sidewalks by November church bells every Sunday at 9. No crime to speak of. My dad kept his badge in a coffee mug by the phone. Some weeks he didn't wear it once. That winter we had a late freeze. Everything felt a little slower. Mail got held up, tires needed air more often, but nothing felt wrong. Not yet. I remember the week before it happened, Ryan hadn't shown up for Sunday school. The teacher said he was sick, but when I asked Mrs. Albright at the grocery store the next day, she just smiled tight and said, "He's been tired lately." Not worried, just distracted. Then on Thursday, I overheard my dad on the phone. He was off duty but still took calls from the dispatch. He said something like, "That's the 3rd time this month. Did he log it?" I didn't know who he meant. But he didn't smile when he hung up. The next morning was colder than usual, down near 18 degrees. Frost so thick it looked like snow. I remember that specifically because my mom scraped the windshield twice and still couldn't see clearly. I sat in the back seat with my thermos watching the bus pull away from the curb 2 blocks ahead. Just tail lights fading into the mist. That was the last time anyone I knew ever saw Bus 37. When I got to school, I noticed something felt delayed. Not wrong, not scary, just off. The front office light wasn't on. The bell rang late, and in homeroom, a note was passed to our teacher. She read it, then looked up and counted heads, then she counted again. That afternoon, I walked past the bus lot on my way home. Bus 37's parking space was empty. I didn't think much of it at the time, but that night my dad didn't come home for dinner, and the next morning he left his badge on. Something had shifted. We just didn't know yet how far it would reach. The day after the bus didn't show, the phones rang nonstop. Teachers, dispatchers, cafeteria staff, even older students were pulled into answering lines. There weren't enough hands. By noon, the front office at Harrow Creek Elementary looked like a crisis center. Folded coats sat untouched on hooks. Brown bag lunches stayed sealed in cubbies. You'd hear a phone ring, someone say a name, then silence, then another name. The calls weren't frantic at first. They were cautious, confused. One parent thought their child had been dropped off somewhere else. Another was sure their daughter had just missed the bus. Maybe she was with a friend. But by mid-morning, the pattern sharpened. 12 names, all supposed to be on Bus 37, all absent. At 8:44 a.m., the school secretary contacted the transportation office. They confirmed the bus had left on time. But no one could raise the driver, not by radio or landline. By 9:10, 2 patrol units were sent to drive the rural route. I remember my mom standing at the kitchen window, cordless phone to her ear, one hand on the glass. She didn't know yet. Not officially. But she must have heard something in my dad's voice. He wasn't supposed to work that Friday. He'd already pulled his truck around by the time she hung up. No uniform, just jeans boots and his sheriff's jacket slung over the passenger seat. That was the last time I saw him in a regular rhythm for weeks. From the front porch, I watched him pull out onto Riverbend Road and head west toward the bus lot. When I got to school, it was past 9:30. Only half the class was there. I didn't ask questions. None of us did. Something about the way the adults avoided eye contact told us not to. I do remember that the principal, Mr. Yarrow, stood outside the front office with his tie loosened, talking to 2 police officers I didn't recognize. Not our usual town guys. One of them had a state patch on his shoulder. That's when it started to feel bigger. Not just a delay, not just a wrong turn. Something else. I heard the word missing for the first time that afternoon. A 3rd grader said it to a hall monitor while they were unlocking the art room. She whispered it like it was a slur. The teachers didn't correct her. Outside, the temperature had dropped. A thin layer of snow started falling around lunch, soft and dry, not enough to stick. I walked home that day. No one stopped me. The buses had been grounded. I remember counting mailboxes as I passed them, the kind with painted flags and little plastic cardinals screwed on top. Everyone had their porch lights on early. By evening, the school had contacted every parent in the district. There were no accidents reported, no distress calls, no sightings past 6:47 a.m. when a local farmer named Ernie Briggs saw the bus pass his property same time it always did. He waved like always. It didn't wave back like always. That was the last confirmed sighting. The local fire department sent volunteers to walk the backfields on foot. Game wardens searched the riverbed by the silo. State troopers were called in to grid the side roads. All they found were tire tracks frozen into old mud, none matching the school bus's dimensions. No wreckage, no skid marks, no debris, nothing, as if the vehicle had folded into the tree line. That night, my dad didn't come home. He called once. Told my mom to tell me to stay off the phone and to keep the kitchen radio on in case dispatch gave instructions. His voice sounded wrong, tight and hollow. I heard him ask her quietly if Ryan's parents had come in. She said they had, both of them, still waiting in the church annex. I asked what happened to Ryan. She didn't answer, just stirred the soup a little harder. That was the first time I noticed her hands were shaking. The official report would later show that the last known radio transmission from Bus 37 came in at 6:41 a.m., just a routine check-in. Brenner reporting on Schedule 12 loaded. He used the same language every morning. Brenner was that kind of man. Quiet, dependable. Not warm exactly, but never harsh. He'd driven that same route for 19 years. Everyone knew his habits. He smoked a single cigarette between stop 5 and stop 6. He didn't use the horn. And he always took the back loop road, an old winding stretch that cut through farmland and logging trails. The idea that he had missed a stop, let alone vanished, didn't make sense to anyone who knew him. Around midnight, the school parking lot was lit up with flood lamps. Parents sat inside their running cars with thermoses of bad coffee waiting for news. A few of the kids' names were being whispered already. Ryan Albright, Tasha Dent, Marcus Clay. I think most of the town still believed they'd be found within the next 24 hours. Maybe the bus had broken down somewhere remote. Maybe the radio cut out. The fields had valleys that could hide a signal. That's what people told themselves. My dad didn't come home the next morning either. My mom said he was at the old mill coordinating search parties. But I saw his cruiser parked behind the fire station just before dusk, engine idling. He was still inside, just staring straight ahead. The window was rolled halfway down and snow had gathered along the edge of the glass. I didn't call out to him, just kept walking. I don't think he even saw me. The next Sunday, only 8 kids showed up at church. The teacher didn't lead a lesson, just kept folding and unfolding a paper bulletin in her lap. At the front of the room, the attendance sheet still hung on the chalkboard. Ryan's name was there. His chair stayed empty. That afternoon, the first flyers were printed. No photos of the bus yet, just names and contact numbers. They stapled them to the utility poles along the north end of town. I remember because I passed one on my way to the grocery store. My mom made me wear gloves even though it wasn't that cold. When I reached the corner by the florist shop, I saw the flyer flapping loose against the wind. The name at the top was Ryan's. The ink had already started to bleed. The snow melted for a few days after that, then came back heavier. The roads froze deep. That's when people stopped talking about delays and started using the word gone. Some parents kept their kids home. Others showed up at the school unannounced just to walk the halls, hoping to see a backpack or lunchbox in the lost and found. People whispered theories in checkout lines and church basements. Some thought the bus had driven into a lake or quarry and was sitting at the bottom. Others said it had crossed state lines and was somewhere far from here. One woman told my mother she saw it pull into an old barn lot 2 towns over, but when deputies followed up, the place was empty. No barn, just an open field and a ditch full of melted tires. Every explanation came up short, like something had swallowed it. And by the end of that week, the police tape had stretched across the bus garage. The Board of Education issued a statement calling the incident a complex, ongoing matter involving multiple agencies. But I remember what my dad said that Friday night after he finally came home 2 days unshaven and still in his boots. He didn't sit at the table, just stood in the doorway holding a folder in one hand and a mug in the other. My mom asked if they had a lead. He said no. Not even a clue. Not even a wrong turn. Just silence. Then he looked down at the mug and said, "But the gas tank was half full." That was the part that got to him. Whatever happened to bus 37 wasn't rushed. Someone had time. I don't think people realize how fast a cold case starts to freeze. It's not a single moment, it's quiet choices stacking up. A call delayed, a search called off, a meeting rescheduled. That's how it was with bus 37. By the end of February '87, the story had slipped out of the front page and into rumor. They still held community briefings, but the maps were just outlines. Search zones marked and remarked. Nothing new, no progress. At 10 years old, I didn't know what jurisdiction meant. I just knew my dad came home quieter each night and every radio in the house stayed on. There was one in the kitchen, one by the front door, and his old shortwave set up in the basement with wires strung through a basement window. When I asked what he was listening for, he said, "Anything." Not in a dramatic way, just flat. Like the word itself had stopped meaning much. Some parents held on to hope longer than others. Ryan's mom, I remember, used to sit in her driveway with the garage door open as if she was waiting for a car that might pull in. Other families moved, not right away, over time. By summer, 4 houses on the north side were empty, curtains still up, grass growing long. One of the boys who disappeared, Kevin Witt, had a younger brother. He was in 2nd grade then. After Kevin vanished, the school transferred him to a different classroom and stopped using the word missing. It became absent. A policy thing, I guess. Easier on paperwork. The state pulled out of the investigation early April, I think. There were no signs of foul play, no bodies, no crime scene to speak of. Just absence. I remember overhearing a conversation my mom had with another teacher in the grocery store parking lot. The other woman said, "Maybe they never got on the bus." My mom didn't answer. Just put the eggs in the back seat and closed the door. When I turned 25, I joined the department. Not because of the case, not at first. I just wanted something steady. Dispatch gave me nights, which suited me fine. I liked working in the quiet, filing records, logging evidence tags. It wasn't exciting, but it felt useful. Every once in a while, someone would bring up the bus, usually in passing, usually late. The older officers would mention Brenner the driver, how he was solid, reliable, never missed a route. Then the conversation would move on. The case had become a kind of wallpaper, there but no longer seen. When my dad retired in 2005, he left me a few boxes from his office, mostly old notebooks, unused evidence labels, some copies of daily logs. I didn't open them for years. Then, in 2011, when we were closing the old archive wing, I came across a folder labeled HCSD 8713, Bus 37. It was thin, just a few handwritten statements, copies of Brenner's license, the route manifest. I remember flipping through it looking for something that wasn't there. I don't know what exactly. A photo, maybe. A detail. Something out of place. Instead, I found an interview transcript from the school counselor typed on carbon paper, barely legible. She'd spoken to each of the 12 kids in the weeks before the disappearance. Routine check-ins, mostly about grades and behavior. But one note stood out. It was about Ryan. Dated December 17, 1986. It said student mentioned not feeling safe on the bus Thursdays. Unclear why. When asked, directly changed subject. Possible attention-seeking behavior. Monitor further. I read that line 3 times. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, but because of the day. Thursday. That was the day they disappeared. January 15th, 1987. A Thursday. That was the first moment I felt something stir that hadn't moved in years. The kind of weight that sits behind your ribs and doesn't let you breathe quite right. I kept digging. Over the next few months, I spent most of my off hours at the Historical Society, dusty back rooms, boxes stacked to the ceiling, nothing digitized. I started looking at old bus schedules, county maintenance records, even property sales near the last known sighting. That's how I found Parcel 41B. An old farmhouse listed as abandoned since 1995, 30 miles southwest of town. It had changed hands twice, once to a trust, once to a private owner out of state. But before that, it had been rented out by the Reimer family, and in 1987 the tenant listed was a man named Harold Denton. That name didn't ring any bells. But in one of my dad's notebooks buried near the back, I found a page with the initials HD, a date, and the phrase, radio install off book. It meant nothing at the time. Just another dead end. I filed it, flagged it, moved on. Then, in March of 2024, I got a call from a remodeling crew outside town. A contractor named Eli Granger was flipping a house, said he found something in the wall. Thought it might be evidence. When I got there, I expected to find some old tools or maybe a squirrel nest. Instead, I found a red backpack, faded moldy around the seams, but intact. On the front, stitched in black thread, property of Ryan Albright. I didn't move for a while. Inside the bag were Polaroids, mostly dark grainy, but a few were clear enough to make out faces, children in a bus aisle. Ryan, Tasha, Kevin, some looking straight at the lens. At the bottom of the bag, a cassette tape, labeled in blue pen, Stop 13, Play Me. We had to borrow a player from one of the techs. When we transferred the audio, it started with static, then a child's voice, Ryan's, scared but clear. He said the bus didn't stop at his house, said they were being taken to a red farmhouse, said it wasn't a field trip. Then he paused and added, "Please don't let my mom think I ran away." That's when I knew my father had seen this tape, or one like it. He'd written Stop 13 in that same notebook. He just never told anyone. I pulled the old file that night, reread every interview, every witness statement. Most of them were thin, vague, but one detail kept resurfacing. A man seen near the bus yard a few weeks before the disappearance. Not a driver, not a mechanic. Someone helping with wiring according to a line in the maintenance log. No name, just authorized by supervisor. The supervisor back then was Lyle Heller, retired in 1989, died in 2004. There were no records of who that man was. No photo, no signature. But in the 1986 yearbook Harrow Creek Elementary Student Life section, there's a cafeteria photo. Just a background shot. Kids eating lunch. Nothing staged. But at the far edge of the frame, there's a man sitting alone at a table. Mid-40s. Square jaw. Ring on his right hand. Not faculty. Not listed. He's looking at the kids. Not smiling. And on his finger, clear as day, is a thick silver band, engraved with a spiral, black, worn into the metal. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I opened my father's old mug, the one where he used to keep his badge. At the bottom was a slip of folded paper. On it, in pencil, Ring Isodal's spiral. Thursday, Ixol's pattern. Ask Miriam. Miriam Albright, Ryan's mother. I hadn't spoken to her in over a decade, but she still lived on Pine Street. Same porch light, same curtains. I knocked once. She opened the door without asking who it was, and in her eyes I saw something I hadn't felt since I was 10. Recognition. And fear. She didn't ask why I was there. Just stepped back and held the door open like she'd been waiting on me for years. The living room hadn't changed since I was a kid. Same crocheted throw across the back of the couch. Same glass front cabinet filled with knickknacks and photographs that hadn't been dusted in a while. The air smelled like lemon cleaner, and tea bags left too long in the cup. Miriam Albright walked slow, like her knees were giving her trouble, but she didn't lean on anything. She poured 2 mugs of black tea in the kitchen and brought them to the coffee table. I don't think either of us planned to talk first. She just stared at her hands for a while, then looked up and said, "You found his things?" I nodded. She didn't ask where or how. I said we recovered a backpack. That it was his, no question. Her eyes didn't well up, didn't shift. She just nodded again, as if something had finally settled. I told her about the tape, about the voice message, about how he said it wasn't a field trip, and how he hoped she wouldn't think he ran away. That part made her flinch just slightly, but I saw it. I told her he'd mentioned a red house, that the driver passed his stop, and that something about Thursdays made him nervous. She sat still through all of it. When I stopped talking, she got up and walked to the hallway. Came back a minute later, holding a small keepsake box with a felt bottom and a latch that clicked when it closed. Inside were a few drawings, crayon on construction paper, one of a bus, another of a bridge, a third of a stick figure standing in front of a house with a red roof. All of them had the same thing drawn in the sky, a black spiral. In one, the spiral sat just above the bus. In another, it was on the door. In the last, the spiral floated over a field filled with blank-faced children all holding hands. He called them dreams, she said. Started drawing them that winter. Told me it was nothing, just things he saw when he closed his eyes. She said Ryan began getting sick every Thursday morning. No fever, no cough, just pale, anxious, and quiet. Said he would sit on the floor near the heater and stare at the carpet like something might reach through it. He didn't want to get on the bus, she said. He never told me why. I told him it was probably a phase, that it would pass. I asked her if she remembered anything unusual around that time, any visitors, any unfamiliar names. She paused for a long moment, then said, "There was a man. I think he was from the school, but I don't remember seeing him before that year. Came by once to talk about a radio malfunction on the bus. Said it was just a district issue, nothing serious. She didn't remember his name, but she remembered his hand. He wore a ring, she said. Big silver. Black shape in the middle. Not a stone. More like a symbol. She drew it on the inside of the tea carton. A spiral. Same as Ryan's drawings. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked down at the ink bleeding through the cardboard and felt that weight again, like something old had been sitting right behind the drywall of this town for years, and now it had a name. When I got back to the precinct, I pulled every employee file tied to transportation between 1985 and 1987. driver's subs, maintenance, administrative. One name stood out: Gerald Denton, listed as a temporary fill-in for 3 weeks in late '86. No photo on file. No home address after 1991. There was a side note from the maintenance supervisor at the time, Lyle Heller, clearing Denton to assist with off-hours vehicle check, which included Bus 37. That file had been flagged once for review, then marked inactive. I pulled the old interview logs again. None of the students mentioned a Gerald, but one, Tasha Dent, had told the school nurse that her new driver sings songs in the back roads and says not to tell Mr. Brenner. The note was dated January 3, 1987, 10 days before the disappearance. The entry had been dismissed as imagination. A game, maybe. I requested access to the old lot where Bus 37 had been serviced. It had been sold off in the late 90s, turned into a metalworks warehouse, but the rear service drive was still intact. I wanted to walk it myself, stand in the place they would have pulled the bus in. The sun was setting by the time I got there. The asphalt was cracked and littered with pine needles, and a caved-in service shed sat just beyond the lot. Inside it smelled like rust and cedar. On a sidewall near an old fuse box, someone had spray-painted a spiral. Faded but visible. It wasn't gang tagging. It wasn't art. Just a symbol, like someone marking a space, not decorating it. I took a photo, logged the location, and called it in. A week later, CSU unearthed a sealed trapdoor beneath the farmhouse Ryan had described in the tape. It had been missed during the initial cavity sweep, likely resealed in the mid-90s. Behind it, a basement room. The walls were lined in felt. Dolls set on shelves. A mattress. No windows. Burn marks in the floorboards carved spirals into the paneling. On the far wall in crayon, a child's handwriting. Stop 13. Mine goes up. I didn't breathe for a long time after I read that. I think part of me had been trying not to believe this was real, not completely. But standing in that room, you could feel the air shift, like the house had kept something buried too long. They brought in floodlights, fingerprint kits, sample bags, everything you'd expect. But I stayed outside. I sat on the steps and watched the wind roll through the empty trees while the tape markers went up behind me. And that's when it hit me. The house was red once. You could still see the color bleeding through the flaked paint on the north side where the sun hadn't worn it down. A red house, off route, on a Thursday, a boy who didn't want to go, and a driver with no name. I pulled my coat tighter and told CSU to keep the crawl space sealed until we could get ground radar in. Then I drove back into town. I didn't turn the radio on. I didn't call anyone. I just parked in the station lot and sat there for a while looking at the passenger seat. Ryan's drawings were still in the folder. I turned the top one over. On the back, written in pencil light, and careful, he'd written the words, "He watches from the front. But he doesn't drive." It stayed with me, that last line on the back of Ryan's drawing. He watches from the front, but he doesn't drive. I couldn't let it go. I ran it through every possibility I could think of someone riding along a second Adulta lookout. But nothing stuck in place. Not until I pulled the old bus route sheets again and started cross-referencing student drop-offs with that strange note Ryan had scribbled in the basement. Stop 13. Mine goes up. It was the phrasing that bothered me. Not I get off at stop 13. Not even my stop. Just mine goes up. The only map I could get from that era was a poor scan, grainy and curled on the edges, but it showed the old Bus 37 loop through Pine Hollow and the farmland stretch east of Mill Creek. Stop 13 was on County Road 12 near a long disused quarry trail that ran behind what used to be Franklin Orchard. It was mostly overgrown now. No kids lived out there anymore. I went out early the next morning, took a printed copy of the stop list with me. There was still a partial metal post at the old drop site, maybe 4 feet high, half swallowed by weeds and mud. Behind it, a slope led up to a rise overlooking a dense line of pines, and beyond that, the barely visible roof of a storage barn. I followed the trail up. It was muddy and steep, and the woods were quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence where you feel like someone else is waiting to speak. The barn door was padlocked, but it was rusted straight through. I cut it with bolt cutters and stepped inside. The smell was the first thing, dust motor oil and something faint underneath it all, like mold or stagnant air trapped for too long. It was mostly empty, except for old crates, some tire stacks, and a line of wooden theater seats bolted to the floor along the far wall. They looked out of place, like someone had hauled them in and arranged them for a purpose that didn't belong to the space. I walked over slowly. 5 seats. Worn cushions. Something scratched into the underside of the middle armrest. I crouched down, pulled my phone flashlight close. It read, 13 sings. Don't speak back. I stood up and took a step back. That's when I saw it. On the wall behind the chairs at child height was a patch of paint peeled away in a perfect oval. Behind it, scratched into the wooden plank, was the same spiral. But this one was filled in black, a tight coil like something pressed down with the point of a blade over and over until the wood gave way. I photographed it, called it in. But even as I backed away, I felt like I'd stepped into something older than I could name, something that didn't want to be found. The forensic team didn't find any blood or prints, no fibers, no bone fragments, just the spiral and the chairs. I asked if anyone remembered when they were brought in. No records, no receipts, no fingerprints, just dust and the faint smell of kerosene which no one could explain. A few days later, I received a voicemail from a woman named Connie Ward. She said she was calling on behalf of her sister Nadine, the same Nadine who'd ridden bus 37 in '86. Said Nadine didn't like phones anymore, but she'd seen something on the news about the reopened case and wanted to talk. I met them at their home just outside Sutter's Ridge. Nadine was soft-spoken, early 40s now, her hair pulled back tight like she didn't want it to move. She offered me tea, but didn't drink any herself. When she finally started speaking, it was slow, careful, like she'd been practicing. She said she used to sit in the back of the bus, always the same seat right side, last row near the emergency exit. One Thursday, she said the bus didn't turn left at the orchard like it was supposed to. It kept going. Nobody said anything at first. But after a few minutes, one of the boys, maybe Kyle or Trent, asked if they were going a new way. She remembered Mr. Brenner, the regular driver, wasn't there that week. Said the sub didn't answer, just kept singing softly under his breath. She couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a lullaby. Nadine said she remembered the sun hitting the back of his head through the glass. It looked like he didn't have a shadow, she said. I asked her to explain. She said it wrong at first, said he didn't cast a shadow. But then she corrected herself. No, she said. It was more like his head didn't catch the light. Like the sun touched everything around him, but not him. Connie touched her sister's arm, then grounding her. I didn't press further. Nadine said the bus eventually did. A wide loop came back around from the south and resumed the route like nothing happened. But something changed after that. She stopped sitting in the back, started riding her bike instead when the weather was good. He never looked back, she said. But I think he knew who was watching. As I was leaving, Connie handed me a folder, said it was something Nadine had kept all these years. Inside were old drawings, not unlike the ones Ryan had done. One caught my attention immediately, a crude sketch of a figure standing in the aisle of a bus. No face, just a head drawn like a hole with black pencil marks swirling inward. Every child in the seats had a line connecting them to that central figure, like strings. The drawing was dated January 9th, 1987, 4 days before Ryan went missing. I thanked them both and left. Drove in silence for a long time. That night I pulled Ryan's last tape again, the one from the recorder in his backpack. I listened more carefully this time. At the 15-second mark, right after he says he missed his stop, there's a faint hum. Not from the bus, not road noise. Something tonal, almost like a tuning fork. I boosted the audio, ran a few filters, and there it was. 3 descending notes. Same pattern, repeating. I went back to the barn photos. On one of the theater chairs, faintly scratched into the wooden backrest, were 3 musical notes. Same 3, a descending triad. Not a melody, a signal. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the waveform. That's when I remembered something Nadine had said almost as an afterthought, that the man who drove that week never opened the emergency exit. Not once. Even during drills. Said he just told the kids to stay seated and listen for the song. The phrase kept echoing in my head. Listen for the song. It didn't feel like a metaphor anymore. It felt like something literal, like a command that had been repeated so many times it had settled into the bones of these kids. I couldn't stop thinking about those 3 descending notes on the tape, the ones etched into the back of that theater seat. A tuning fork, a signal, a trigger, maybe all 3. I sent the audio clip to a contact at the state forensic lab, a man named Rudy Bell who specialized in acoustic anomalies. We'd crossed paths a few times during prior cases involving tampered 911 tapes. He called me back 2 days later, voice low, like he didn't want to be overheard. Said it wasn't just 3 tones. It was 3 tones layered with something underneath, barely audible but structured. Like a whisper that had been electronically masked. I asked if he could pull it out. He said he'd try, but it'd take time. While I waited, I kept digging into the school records. I requested full faculty employment logs for 1985 through 1988. Teachers, substitutes, bus drivers, custodians, anyone paid through the district. That's when I hit something. A name I hadn't seen before. Gerald Esmond. Hired as a contract substitute driver in fall of '86. Listed as working 3 non-consecutive weeks across that school year, all under a vendor listing for Denton Valley Transit, a private third-party contractor the district used during driver shortages. No photo, no tax ID. And his background check came back as file not retained. I ran his name through state licensing databases. Nothing in the DMV, nothing in CDL logs. It was like he didn't exist beyond that invoice. But what stopped me cold was a note in the margin of the HR ledger written in ballpoint pen, nearly faded out. See bus 37 route deviation, 15-9. The week Ryan disappeared. I drove to the district archives building myself, requested the transportation logs. The clerk on duty was a woman named Celeste, probably in her late 60s, white hair pulled back with a barrette. I explained I was working on an old case, asked if she could help me find physical logs from the winter of '87. She looked at me for a long second, then said quietly, "You're talking about that boy, aren't you?" I just nodded. She didn't ask anything else. Just stood up, unlocked a side room, and came back 10 minutes later with a bound book nearly falling apart at the seams. She laid it on the counter, flipped to the January pages. There it was, bus 37, and under the notes section for January 6th route, adjusted for Orchard Slope driver discretion. The entry was initialed GE. I looked at her. She was already staring at the page like she'd seen it before years ago. I asked if she remembered Esmond. She shook her head, but not like someone unsure, more like someone afraid to speak. "He didn't clock in," she said. "Didn't sign the roster. I only knew his name because of that week. He wasn't like the others. He never came inside, just waited by the bus lot fence until someone brought out the keys. I asked if she remembered what he looked like. She paused again, then said, "He always wore the same thing. Gray jacket, black cap, gloves, even in the afternoon." I thanked her and left. Sat in my car for almost 20 minutes trying to fit that image against the faceless figure in all the kids' drawings. That night, Rudy sent me a cleaned-up version of the audio. It was faint, but undeniable. The 3 notes were followed by something rhythmic, 4 clicks, then a voice. 1 word, drawn out like it had been spoken in a room with too many corners. 13. I played it over and over, the sound of that word dissolving into the bus rumble. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I drove out to the old orchard slope. There wasn't much left, just a narrow turnout where the bus might have pulled over and the start of a gravel incline overgrown with brush. I walked it slowly, noting the way the trees leaned inward near the top, almost forming a natural arch. There were tire ruts, still faint in the ground, too deep to be recent. At the top of the rise, I found something small sticking out of the dirt, a corroded quarter probably dropped decades ago. I brushed the soil away and saw the year 1986. That shouldn't have meant anything, but I felt it in my chest like a lock turning. I stood there a while longer, just listening to the wind move through the dry leaves, and then I heard it so faint I thought I imagined it. A low hum, 3 descending tones, the same pattern, but not mechanical. It sounded like it came from somewhere inside the earth. I didn't move, just turned my recorder on and stood perfectly still. After it faded, there was silence. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of my own footsteps as I backed away. I submitted the recording that afternoon, logged my report, filed the quarter as evidence. But I didn't tell anyone what I'd heard. Not yet. Something about it felt like a test, like naming it too soon would make it disappear. That evening, I checked the archived yearbook for '86 again. One of the girls, Anna Phelps, had moved away the following summer. Her address on file was in upstate New York. I called. Her mother answered. Said Anna didn't talk about that time, hadn't in years. But after a long pause, she added, she used to hum something in her sleep, over and over, like a lullaby. But it wasn't any song I knew. I asked if she remembered what it sounded like. She hesitated. 3 notes, she said finally, like the kind a music box would play, downward, sad. I thanked her. We hung up. I didn't sleep much that night either. The next morning, someone had slipped a manila envelope under the door of my office. No name, no return address. Inside were 3 things: a photo of a school bus parked under trees I didn't recognize, a cassette labeled simply "Ride Home," and a note written in uneven script. Not every door opens out. The cassette had been dubbed from something older that was clear as soon as I played it. The tape hiss was constant, like it had lived too long in a drawer next to batteries. Still, the contents were unmistakable. First, the familiar whine of a bus door folding shut, followed by the steady churn of a diesel engine. Then faint voices, kids, laughing, calling out, one of them singing something off-key in the background. A girl, maybe 9 or 10, singing those same 3 notes, drawing them out like a tune she didn't know the words to. That part only lasted about 30 seconds before the sound changed. You hear it subtly at first, like the mic shifted inside someone's coat pocket. The laughter dulls. The voices fade. And then a low hum takes over, mechanical, but not from the bus. More constant. Droning. After the hum, silence. Not the kind where the recorder stops, just the kind where nothing's making sound anymore. I let it play through twice before taking the envelope and tape down to evidence intake. No fingerprints on the photo or the cassette casing. No postmark on the envelope either. Just dropped off by hand. I logged everything, copied the tape, then took a trip out to the place in the photo. It took me longer than I expected. I had to cross-reference the tree line with archived plat maps, but I eventually found it an old rest pullout west of Route 17, long overgrown and gated off. The bus in the photo was gone, obviously, but the trees matched. One of the trunks still had a faint line of paint across it, like something had once backed into it. I walked the area slowly, careful where I stepped. On the far end of the clearing, just past the last tree, I found the remains of a small concrete slab. Cracked, sunken, overtaken by moss. Like it had once supported something, maybe a utility box or signage that had since been removed. There were no markings, but I noticed something odd. Just to the right of the slab, the ground dipped unnaturally. Not a sinkhole, more like a hatch, had once been lifted. The soil had that loose texture, disturbed and resettled even after all these years. I took photos, marked the coordinates, and filed a request with Public Works to pull any historical plans tied to the site. They called me back 2 days later. A man named Holt from District Infrastructure told me the pullout had originally been a way station access road in the late 60s, decommissioned in '74. No remaining utilities, no current easement, no ownership. Technically, the land fell into what he called a jurisdictional shadow. Nobody claimed it. I asked if anything was built beneath the surface storm drains, access tunnels, runoff systems. He hesitated, then said, "Not on record. But there's a lot that was never digitized." I made a plan to return this time with ground-penetrating radar. A retired forensics guy I knew, Vince Tapley, had access to one through a local recovery volunteer group. We met at the site early the next week. He set the gear up while I flagged the coordinates. We started sweeping in tight arcs. Nothing at first, just tree root interference. But when we passed over the sunken patch near the slab, the display lit up. Rectilinear void about 6 feet by 3 depth, unclear due to soil compaction. Vince adjusted the gain, tried a second pass. "Could be an old crawl," he muttered. "Could be a burial chamber. But it's hollow. That much is clear." I requested a dig permit that same day. Took nearly a week to push through. When we finally got approval, I coordinated with the sheriff's department and a small team from the local anthropology lab. We excavated carefully, layer by layer. It didn't take long. About 14 inches down, we struck metal. The edge of a panel, corrugated rusted set, flush against a poured concrete border. A hatch, sealed with a bolt that had fused from time and weather. We used a portable angle grinder to cut through the corrosion. The first attempt failed. The second gave way with a shriek that echoed too long through the trees. When the panel finally lifted, the air that escaped was dry and metallic. Not rotten, but ancient, like a place that had been forgotten on purpose. Inside was a cavity no deeper than 5 feet. Walls of poured concrete corners sloped. No steps, just a flat basin. Lying in the center was what looked like a child's backpack, half rotted. Next to it, a pair of small sneakers neatly placed side by side. Between them, a folded paper map sealed in plastic. I reached for it carefully. The plastic was brittle, but intact. The map was hand-drawn in pencil, yellowed from age. It showed no roads, just tree lines, arrows, and a marked path labeled in uneven handwriting, "Go this way when the song plays." The line stopped at a crude drawing of a circle surrounded by triangles. No town names, no compass. Just that one phrase at the top, "Ride home." We took everything into custody. I scanned the map that night and overlaid it against current aerial photos. It didn't line up with the way station or orchard slope. It pointed farther north into a section of old state forest that had burned partially in the late '90s. The road into that area had been closed ever since marked unsafe due to fallen trees and washed-out trails. I made a few calls. A forestry officer named Max Donnelly agreed to guide me in the next morning. He'd grown up in the area and remembered some of the fire lines from the old suppression maps. We hiked in just past sunrise. The terrain was rough, no maintained paths, just mud and char and clusters of young pine breaking through the ash. About a mile in, Max slowed, held up a hand. We'd reached a clearing. At the center stood a ring of stones, flat, slate-like, arranged in a perfect circle. I stepped closer. In the middle was a shallow depression, no more than a foot deep, lined with smoothed rock. It didn't look natural. Max didn't speak. just stood at the edge and looked down. I took out the map, compared the lines. It matched. Every angle, every mark. I crouched down, checked the inside of the stone basin. At the very bottom, half buried under a thin layer of soil, was a square of metal. Not a hatch this time, just a plate bolted into the ground. On it, engraved so faint it was almost gone, was one word: 13. I didn't touch it, just stared until the wind picked up. That night I drove home with the map spread across the passenger seat. My radio picked up static for the first time in weeks. 3 descending tones played through the fuzz, then silence, then the faint sound of a child humming. The tones didn't stop. They came again the next night and the one after that. Always the same 3 descending notes, always around the same time, 1:12 a.m. Give or take a minute, I started recording them. There was never any trace of signal activity on my scanner, and no carrier wave I could isolate. Just the tones, followed by that humming. Sometimes it was a child's voice. Sometimes I couldn't tell. I stayed up later each night watching the map, flipping it over, tracing the edges. It didn't lead anywhere new. But the more I stared at it, the more I realized something. The path didn't start at the way station pullout. It ended there. The circle in the trees, the metal plate with the word 13, that wasn't the destination. That was the return point. Ride home wasn't a call to leave. It was where they came back. I called Vince, asked him to meet me again, this time near the orchard slope, the one where the bus had last been seen. We went in early, right after sunrise. The fog was low, but the air had that strange stillness to it, like the sound had been pulled out. We followed the old trail down to the creek bed and climbed the incline where the witness said the bus vanished. At the top, we spread out looking for any signs of disturbed soil or clearing. It was Vince who found it, another slab almost identical to the first. Same dimensions, same concrete mold lines, just more degraded. We circled it twice. Then I saw the edge. There was a seam in the dirt, faint but there. I crouched and brushed the surface with my glove. This one didn't have a hatch. It had a grate sealed over with stone and moss. A faint gust rose from beneath it, cool and dry. We marked it and called in a team. The excavation took longer this time. The grate had been reinforced with poured resin, likely done after it was sealed. But once we got through, what lay beneath wasn't just a chamber. It was a stairwell, narrow, rust-streaked, descending at a sharp angle. The air inside was still. No bugs, no rot. Just dust and something else. Something metallic, like old copper pipe and battery acid. I took the lead flashlight, cutting through layers of settled time. Vince followed. The steps opened into a corridor, maybe 30 feet long, carved straight into the earth. The walls were lined with insulation board pink foam, now gray with age, and above that steel conduit all stripped bare. We walked slowly, our boots crunching on loose plaster and gravel. At the far end was a steel door. It wasn't locked. I reached out, turned the latch and pushed. Inside was a room, maybe 10 feet wide, 12 long. No windows, no furniture. Just the walls lined with peeling corkboard and a grid of photographs. Children. 17 of them. Different years, different seasons, different states. Some in bus seats, some outside gas stations, all looking directly into the camera. At the bottom of each photo was a number written in black ink. Some numbers matched. A few didn't. But one thing was consistent: none of the children had ever been reported found. I checked the file numbers against the archives when I got back to the station. 4 of the cases were still active. One had been closed 22 years ago after a supposed accidental drowning. The boy in that photo, number 12, was last seen at a rest stop in Montana. The same symbol found on the Idaho map was etched on the edge of the photo. 3 interlocking triangles. We scanned the entire room, documented every inch. Hidden behind one of the cork tiles was a panel false wall hinged. Inside it, another cassette, this one unlabeled. I didn't play it right away. We brought it back, logged it, and ran it through forensic duplication first. No prints, no handwriting. The audio was clearer this time. It started with footsteps, slow, deliberate. Then a voice. A man's voice. Calm, unaccented. He said, "This is number 20. She remembers too much. We'll need to reset again. Thursday. Always Thursday. Then static. Then nothing. We ran the voice through the system, no match. But the phrase reset again lined up with a note from one of the archived case files written in pencil on the back of a witness report from 1993. He said I'd be reset, like a tape. That note had never been followed up. The file belonged to a girl named Mara Phelps, age 11, who vanished from a campground in Utah and reappeared 6 days later, 3 counties over, disoriented with no memory of where she'd been. She died in 2004 in a car crash. The only person she spoke to at length before her death was a therapist named Judith Acker. I tracked down Dr. Acker's license retired. Living in Ohio, I called, told her who I was and why I was calling. There was a pause. Then she said, she told me about the ride, about the notes, about the man who said they were passengers, not children. I asked if she ever reported it. She said she had tried, twice, once to local police, once to the FBI. She said the second time a man called her office and told her to drop it or risk losing her practice. The call wasn't traced. I asked if she remembered anything else. She said Mara was afraid of a song. She said it played before the lights changed, that if you heard it a 4th time, you didn't come back. Then she hung up. I sat with that a long while. Then I took out the map again. The route didn't start at the way station. It didn't end at the circle. It passed through, like a circuit, like a track. And the symbols weren't decorations. They were stops, or gates. I made one more call to a contact at the National Transportation Safety Board. I asked him to look up any decommissioned or destroyed buses matching the description from the photo. He called back an hour later, said one matched a modified Bluebird Microbird decommissioned in 1989 after a mechanical fire. Registered to a private youth outreach nonprofit. The nonprofit dissolved in 1991. Its founder, a man named Harold Finch, had disappeared that same year. Last known location near the Idaho border. The same region where Mara had vanished. The same forest line shown in the tape. I asked for a copy of the old registration file. He emailed it to me. There was one scanned attachment, a typed intake form. At the bottom, a handwritten signature. Driver H. Finch, Thursday route, entry point 13. I never heard the tones again after that last trip to the orchard slope. Maybe the signal moved. Maybe it stopped because we found what we weren't supposed to. Or maybe it was never meant to be a signal at all. Just a sound for those who'd already been marked one last thread pulling them back towards something they couldn't see and couldn't name. The agency closed the investigation under the umbrella of a classified archival tag non-ordinary containment. That was the phrase. It means they shut it quietly, buried it in a drawer with no precedent. Vince transferred to a desk role a few months later, said he needed out of field work. I didn't blame him. I kept working, but I stopped asking certain questions. The files from the orchard chamber were never released. I still have a copy of the intake form with Harold Finch's name on it. Not because I think it'll change anything, but because it proves someone somewhere signed their name to whatever this was. The map's still folded in my desk drawer. The red ink has started to bleed at the edges, but the symbols remain. 13 gates, 17 children. I know those numbers don't match, and maybe that's the point. Maybe it never lined up cleanly because it wasn't supposed to. The cassette tapes were handed off to a federal archivist. I kept copies. Not for evidence, just to remember the voices, especially the girls, the way she said her name. Not begging, not afraid, just quiet and certain, like she was anchoring herself to the truth. My name is Lily Saunders. I think about that sometimes when I see missing posters or old yearbooks. The way we remember people isn't always how they were, it's how we last saw them. But for someone like Lily, someone who survived, it's not the remembering that matters most. It's the being remembered. And that's why I still talk about this case. Not because I expect justice in the traditional sense, but because there are names in those photos we never recovered. Because someone built a circuit and called it outreach. Because the phrase "ride home" still makes my stomach turn, and because if even one listener hears this and recognizes a voice, a symbol, a stop along that route, then maybe we weren't too late for all of them. Maybe someone else makes it back. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it so no name gets left behind.